lesser extent Hayek, they are seen as mavericks or as people whose views do not comport well with the modern mainstream economics.
What would be one distinction between the Austrian school and what you refer to as mainstream?
A major distinction has to do with what Austrians conceive of as the scientific method appropriate to economic analysis. Modern mainstream economists think that the scientific method of economics ought to be basically the same one used in physics or chemistry. Hypotheses should be tested empirically to find out whether they are true, or at least whether they're not rejected yet and are provisionally acceptable. But the Austrians start with a conception of what they take to be axiomatic truths, and they proceed deductively from that, and the propositions they arrive at are accepted as necessarily true. They don't need any testing, and if we tested them and found them false, we would conclude there's something wrong with the test, which, by the way, mainstream economists often conclude also.
And who is Price Fishback, who wrote that?
Price Fishback is a dear friend of mine and was one of my PhD students at the University of Washington in around 1980, early 1980s.
Our guest is Robert Higgs. This is C-SPAN's In-Depth program, and the first call for him comes from Evansville, Indiana.
First off, I want to thank C-SPAN for their programming. I'm an avid viewer. Mr. Higgs, I have a question. Earlier in the program, it became clear that you disagree with either many of the things our current administration may be deciding to do, or all of those things. Respectfully, what would you do, or could you pick out maybe one or two major decisions the current administration has decided to do in the last 60 days, or even the last a major decision the last 6 months of the previous administration, what they've done, and what you would propose in the alternative?
Well, let's go back to the original bailout plan of early October last year. This was an act of Congress to provide the $700 billion originally for the purpose of having the government purchase so-called toxic assets from financial institutions. And this was a terrific mistake, and the government itself may have seen that because they never used the money for that purpose. Instead, they decided before long that they would use the money to inject capital into financial institutions, and so they did that, giving cash to banks and taking in exchange preferred shares and warrants, which is to say ownership stakes in those institutions. So that was the plan, and that was a disastrous plan, because not only did it mean that politically favored institutions got preferential treatment from the government at enormous expense to the taxpayer, but it also represented an intrusion in what should have been a market process, whereby institutions that had been badly managed, that had acquired assets that had little value and therefore were insolvent, ought to simply have been permitted to go bankrupt. The market system is a system of profit and loss. If badly managed institutions are not allowed to fail, then all the incentives are switched around. And what we end up with is a system of private profit and public loss, where the losses are socialized across all the taxpayers. More recently, we get to the Obama administration with its stimulus plan, another enormous package of spending projects, which are extraordinarily diverse, but probably the best simple way to describe them is to say that they represent handouts to virtually every interest group that the Democratic Party identifies as its friends. And much of the money is going to state governments and local governments, the federal government, of course, for a variety of sweet-sounding projects, such as green investments in insulating buildings and the study of global warming and whatnot. But if you go down the list, although it's often advertised as aimed at providing infrastructure projects, bridges, roads, what have you, a very small proportion of the total package is actually allocated to those purposes. It's pretty much a bailout or a prop-up for government employees more than it is anything else.
And if you go to the Independent Institute's website or to the Christian Science Monitor, you can find this recent op-ed by Dr. Higgs. Instead of stimulus, do nothing. Seriously. Houston, Texas, thanks for holding. You're on with Robert Higgs.
Thank you. I appreciate the time to ask a question. I was calling because there's so much conversation now about how we're using this money, and there was a situation yesterday about a book regarding the ranking of the presidents, and one of our lowest-ranking presidents, Chester Arthur, during his administration, whether he can take credit for it or not, passed the Pendleton Act, which was basing government jobs on merit. And what I was wondering is with all the other opportunities that people have to rationalize why they do things, very seldom is it the best, is it the right thing to do. So I was wondering how you think we can get the country back on track by people following their conscience instead of what's easiest, best, legal, or profitable. Thank you.
Well, my motto would be, don't just stand there, undo something. We live in a world where the government at every level has intruded into private life and into economic life in countless ways. And the consequences have been often destructive, often counterproductive, and we desperately need to reduce the size, scope, and power of government. If we were to do that, we would not be at constant risk of having the government foul up our lives. So long as we have a government, we're always at some risk, but the bigger it is, the greater the risk. So there are any number of things that can be undone, and every time one of them is undone, I think we move in the right direction.
In Against Leviathan, published in 2004, in the introduction, you write, "If I had to use a single word to describe what is fundamentally wrong with government today, I would use the word fraud."
I think I would choose that word because it tells us that government is not what it purports to be. It represents itself as everybody's friend and everybody's savior, as if it either knew what to do to achieve those ends or had an incentive to take those actions, even if it knew what to do. And both of those things are historically demonstrably false. Government officials know mainly how to get elected to public office. That's pretty much the extent of what they know. And after that, it's pretense. It's bringing in experts selected by them to do things that purport to be sensible. But of course, they're not going to bring in any experts that propose programs that would really be averse to their political interests.
Thaxton, Virginia. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I would love to be able to have a very long dinner with your guest. This is just fascinating. Thank you for C-SPAN. How do we recover from the mess, from the damage that's already been done? Is one of my questions. How do we return to the free market principle where that states if you fail, you go out of business? Third question would be, how bad do you think this economy is going to get, and how do we recover from it, and can we stop this trend?
Well, getting back to the free market would require that we travel a very, very great distance. So I think for the foreseeable future, the best we can hope for is that we'll move in the right direction. And at present, we're not. We're moving still in the